Mira Dunham had never planned to return to the house her father built with his own hands, hidden beyond the gravel ridges and dense pine curtain of northwestern Oregon. It stood like an artifact left behind by someone who had always known how to stay 2 steps ahead of other people's business, wrapped in fog and pine scent, perched above a creek that hissed softly in the evenings like a quiet, private ghost. After 2 decades in federal law enforcement, working complex fraud and grant embezzlement cases across the country, Mira had seen enough of people to know she needed distance. Her badge was still active, her leave temporary, but the wounds weren't just professional. They were personal. Her last case hadn't ended with handcuffs, but with public silence and internal compromise, and that stung worse. She didn't need time off. She needed space. And so, when she packed her SUV and drove through 5 states with her 8-year-old son, Noah, sleeping in the back seat, she wasn't chasing healing. She was looking for something that still made sense. The house was just as her father had left it. Weathered shingles, rust-colored tin roof, wrap-around porch half swallowed by blackberry vines. Inside, the air held a smell of dust and cedar, the silence deep and undisturbed, like a room paused in time. The land surrounding it was vast, nearly 30 acres, mostly forest and hills, and entirely outside the jurisdiction of any residential oversight body. No gates, no committees, no neighborhood emails about trash cans or fence colors. Just earth, stone, and memory. For Mira, it was the safest place she could imagine. The house was under her name, the title clean, the survey lines confirmed and recorded. There were no liens, no disputes. It was hers. And for the first time in years, she wanted to believe she could simply live without watching over her shoulder. Noah adjusted quickly. The boy, bright and quiet, with a sharp mind and a stubborn streak that clearly came from Mira's side, took to the freedom like roots to soil. He wandered the creek bed, collecting stones and naming birds. He read his books on the porch and talked to trees like they might talk back. There was no internet, only spotty reception, and Mira liked it that way. She handled groceries and supplies during weekly trips to town, which was 15 minutes south, a small, once logging community now mostly living off tourism, retirees, and people hiding from something. Everyone knew everyone, or at least claimed to. When Mira introduced herself at the general store, she kept it simple. Mira Dunham. Back for a while, my father was Kenneth. That name still meant something in these parts. Kenneth Dunham had been a sheriff for 23 years before retiring and spending his final days out here with his hunting dogs and no interest in anyone else's noise. It was on the 3rd day that Mira met her neighbor. Karen Wexley showed up like someone rehearsing hospitality. Hair too perfect for the humidity, teeth white with forced warmth, arms cradling a plastic container of lemon bars that smelled like artificial sweetener and calculation. Her voice was bright but edged with authority as she approached the fence line uninvited, her shoes crunching the gravel in a rhythm that announced itself louder than her words. "I just thought I'd come over and welcome you to the area," she said, lifting the container slightly, as if that gesture alone should grant her access. Mira stepped down from the porch, taking a moment to study the woman's stance. Not aggressive, but expectant. She took the lemon bars without enthusiasm. "You must be Karen," Mira said, flatly polite. Karen smiled wider, but Mira noted the quick flick of her eyes past her shoulder, scanning the yard like she was already building a map of what didn't fit into her version of normal. "It's a lovely property," Karen said, "though I noticed your son wandering quite close to the water yesterday. I'd be careful with that. That creek's technically part of the environmental buffer zone. There are safety regulations. I assume you've reviewed the local ordinances." Mira paused for a beat, letting the implication hang. "This land is privately owned," she replied. "Surveyed, filed, and excluded from development encroachment when the county redrew its zoning lines 15 years ago. The creek is mine. The banks are mine. The responsibility is mine." Karen's smile twitched. "Well, I'm sure you're doing your best," she said lightly. "But the county's changed a lot in recent years. There's a lot more collaboration now. Community oversight, environmental initiatives, child safety partnerships. People like us, we try to look out for each other, especially when children are involved." Mira nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She had seen this before, not in rural Oregon, but in courtrooms and boardrooms. The thin, performative empathy, the veiled implications, the use of vague collectivism to justify control. "I appreciate your concern," Mira said, "but we're managing just fine." Karen left soon after, her departure as orchestrated as her arrival. Mira watched from the porch as the woman disappeared back into the woods toward the edge of her own property, and something in her gut twisted. Not fear, not yet. Just a familiar pressure behind the eyes, the kind that came right before something started to unravel. That night she checked the windows twice, then sat on the porch with a glass of water and stared into the trees. The wind rustled the leaves gently, but there was no peace in the quiet. The lemon bars remained untouched. By the next morning, Mira noticed subtle changes. A small orange marker flag near the fence post closest to the creek. A laminated sheet stapled to a tree at the edge of the property. Too far to read from the house, but too close to be coincidence. She walked out and peeled it off. It was a generic notice about provisional assessment of environmental waterways, with no letterhead, no contact number, and no issuing office listed. The font was off. Too casual. Someone had made it on their home printer. Later that afternoon, while chopping wood behind the shed, Mira heard Noah call out from the creek. "Mom!" His voice wasn't panicked, but it had urgency. She dropped the axe and jogged toward him. He was standing, knee-deep in the water, holding something up. It was a small wooden stake with a pink ribbon tied around it. "There's more of these," he said. "Someone put them all along the bank." Mira took the stake and examined the ribbon. On it, handwritten in neat block letters, were the words, "Field Survey, Buffer Zone Start." She felt her throat tighten slightly. That evening, Mira reviewed the full documentation of her property. The deed, the surveys, the old maps her father kept in a weatherproof chest under the crawl space. Every line confirmed her boundaries. Every map reaffirmed her legal ownership of the creek and the land surrounding it. She wasn't confused. Someone else wanted her to be. She didn't overreact. She didn't call anyone. But she did something she hadn't done since taking leave. She opened the secured laptop case in the closet, powered it up, and reconnected it to the agency's internal secure net. Not to file anything. Just to make sure her access codes still worked. The next morning, Karen returned. No lemon bars this time, just a clipboard and a laminated badge that wasn't from any agency Mira recognized. "I just wanted to drop off a quick notice," she said, smiling as if they were old friends. "We filed a temporary request for assessment on the property's hydrological impact zone. It's routine. Happens any time a family moves in with children, especially near natural waterways. The form's just a courtesy." Mira took the clipboard and flipped through the pages. Most were blank. The few with print had misspelled agency names, and one form referenced a statute that had been repealed in 1998. She handed it back without signing. "If you step onto my land again without legal cause," she said evenly, "I will treat it as trespass, and if you attempt to interfere with my son, I will escalate that appropriately." Karen didn't argue. She just smiled again, tight and brittle. "Well, let's hope it doesn't come to that," she said. "No one wants conflict, especially in front of children." Mira didn't respond. She closed the gate, walked back to the porch, and sat beside Noah, who was drawing in the dirt with a stick. She didn't tell him anything. Not yet. But in her chest, the stillness was gone. Something had shifted, and she knew. This was no longer about lemon bars or neighborly warnings or ribbons tied to stakes. This was the opening move, and she hadn't spent 2 decades in federal service to misread the board. The sound came just after dawn. 3 firm knocks against the wooden gate, deliberate and unnervingly calm. Mira had already been awake for nearly an hour, sipping coffee at the kitchen table, her eyes scanning a copy of her father's old hand-drawn map of the property. The knocks made her freeze for a second, then stand, setting the mug down without a word. Noah was still asleep upstairs, his breath audible through the open loft. She walked to the front door, pulled on a hoodie, and stepped out onto the porch with a straight back and still shoulders. A white SUV idled just beyond the gate, its engine low, exhaust curling into the morning air. 2 figures stood outside it. Both men, both clean-cut, dressed in dark green jackets without insignias, but with the unmistakable bearing of people who were used to entering spaces with authority. One held a clipboard, the other adjusted something on his belt, the movement casual but calculated. Mira descended the steps and walked to the fence. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady, measured. The taller man spoke first. "Ma'am, we're here conducting a site check. A local civic complaint was filed regarding the environmental stability of this section of the valley. We're following up on reports that development or excavation work may have begun near the creek." Mira didn't blink. "There's been no development, no excavation. This is private land, and no one here has reported or authorized any survey." The man lifted the clipboard slightly, showing her a document with blurred agency formatting and no official stamp. "We're not accusing you of anything," he said with an insincere chuckle. But children were reportedly seen playing unaccompanied near a restricted waterway. "We have an obligation to ensure compliance with child safety regulations. May we come in and take a look?" Mira's eyes didn't leave the paper, though her hands remained at her sides. "You're not from the county," she said. "This isn't your jurisdiction. You're not from any state-recognized body, or you'd have come with credentials and a filed access notice." The second man took a step forward, his posture slightly more assertive. "Ma'am, refusing entry may trigger a more formal assessment. This doesn't have to be confrontational." Mira stepped closer to the gate, lowered her voice. "You're not coming through that gate. Not today. Not unless you return with an official warrant, signed by someone whose name I can verify in a state registry. And if you return without one, I will treat it as harassment and pursue federal charges. I want your names now, and the badge numbers you're not wearing." The taller man's smile thinned and he gave a single nod, as if confirming something silently. Then he turned. The second man hesitated for a beat longer, then followed. Neither gave a name. The SUV drove off slowly, deliberately, the tires crunching over the gravel with exaggerated patience. Mira stood still until the taillights disappeared down the wooded road. That same afternoon, a letter arrived in her mailbox. Plain envelope, no return address, just her name written with mechanical neatness. Inside was a 1-page document titled Child Safety Notice of Inquiry, printed with vague language and informal formatting. It referenced ongoing concern regarding the welfare and supervision of the minor known as Noah Dunham, and cited anonymous reports of isolated behavior, lack of structured care, and environmental hazards. Mira sat on the porch steps as she read it, her thumb brushing over the edge of the page. There were no signatures, no official seal. It wasn't filed with any department. It was a message. She reread the final paragraph twice. "Should this situation persist without remedy or corrective action, we reserve the right to escalate through appropriate municipal and protective services to ensure the safety and regulation of the environment, and minors involved. It was, in essence, a threat, one written to appear harmless, reasonable, even bureaucratic. She folded the letter carefully, tucked it into a manila folder with the stake ribbon and fake creek notice, and brought it inside. By the end of the week, small things began to change. Mira returned from town to find her trash bins moved 20 feet down the road, lids off, contents spilled deliberately, not by an animal, but by hands. The gate lock had been reset, twisted into its latch as if someone had tried a key that didn't quite fit. In the backyard, Noah's boots were soaked and lined up on the wrong side of the deck, though neither she nor he had touched them that day. Then, one morning, just before sunrise, she caught a glimpse of a figure standing at the far edge of the trees, just beyond the clearing near the creek, still facing the house, arms at their sides. Mira reached for the long lens of her binoculars, but by the time she looked again, the figure was gone. Noah started waking up with night terrors, something he hadn't done since he was 4. He told her, quietly, that he'd seen a woman in the woods watching him, but she didn't move, didn't speak, just stared. Her face was wrong, he said once. Mira didn't press. Instead, she installed motion sensor lights across the back of the house and fixed the upstairs window locks. She didn't report it. Not yet. Not until she had more than silhouettes and altered trash bins. She knew how systems worked, how they ignored reports of vague violations, and how a single counter-complaint from the wrong person could flip suspicion onto the one calling for help. Mira didn't fear being watched. She feared how watching could be weaponized when layered with a false narrative and bureaucratic smoke. It escalated again when Noah's school called. The secretary's tone was cautious but clear. "We received an inquiry from someone claiming to be your son's guardian. They were asking about his attendance, requesting to schedule a meeting with the school counselor. They had some of his personal info, enough to sound legitimate, but the paperwork didn't check out, so we didn't proceed." Mira's blood went cold. She thanked the woman, requested copies of everything, and drove to the school within the hour. She spent the next 4 hours speaking with the principal, the counselor, and the district security contact, verifying every access protocol tied to Noah's profile. They agreed to add her alert code to all future requests, flag any inquiry, and restrict all communications unless confirmed in person or through secure email. She left with photocopies of the forged request. It was signed Karen Wexley in looping script that mimicked handwriting meant to look both authoritative and warm. That night, Mira sat in her father's study, now repurposed with folders and legal pads scattered across the desk, and read everything she had collected. Her instincts didn't scream danger. They whispered it. This wasn't random. This wasn't about the environment or creek rights or harmless overreach. Someone was staging a slow, deliberate encirclement, testing her boundaries, physical, legal, and psychological, while building a paper trail that could later justify forced action. She recognized the strategy. She'd seen it used by fraudulent real estate consortiums in Utah, by child custody manipulation groups in Arizona, by regulatory overreach schemes in Nevada. Only this time, the playbook was local, intimate, and aimed at her son. Mira didn't panic. She didn't rant or fall apart. Instead, she opened a secured messaging window on her work laptop. She didn't log into the agency's direct system, but sent a discreet query to an old contact at the Office of Legal Integrity, a quiet, internal desk that tracked civil manipulation cases connected to state corruption. She didn't explain everything, just requested a quiet cross-check of public filing names for Wexley and a flag on any child safety petitions connected to her parcel's district. She knew it would take time. She knew they wouldn't reply unless something was flagged. And still, it was a move. A measured, legal step that would give her footing if the pressure continued. The next morning, Noah found a note tucked under a rock by the front gate. It was written in permanent marker on torn notebook paper. Some people don't know how to care for kids. They confuse isolation for love. No signature. Just those words. Mira read it twice, folded it slowly, and looked up toward the road. The sun had just crested the treetops, casting long shadows that made everything seem distant and unreal. But it wasn't unreal. It was methodical, and whoever was behind it wasn't just testing her patience. They were preparing to strike at the heart of what they assumed was her weakness. They didn't know it was her strength. Not yet. It was just after 9 a.m. when the letter arrived. Official this time, printed on heavy cream-colored paper with a watermarked seal of the County Department of Environmental and Civil Concerns. Mira stood in the kitchen, still holding her second cup of black coffee when she heard the mailbox lid clang shut. She knew it before she even opened it. Something about the weight of the envelope and the name of the issuing office told her it wasn't another anonymous scare tactic. This one had teeth, or at least the appearance of it. She slid her thumb under the seal and unfolded the notice, scanning the language quickly. The document stated that a formal administrative petition had been filed against her property, citing repeated unregulated proximity of a minor to sensitive hydrological terrain, referencing the local ordinance on buffer zones, which she knew was outdated and non-binding on private land. It included a time-stamped statement that an investigation into child environmental endangerment would begin within 72 hours, with the possibility of temporary relocation of the child during the review process. It was signed by a department representative she didn't recognize and co-signed by a community liaison, Karen Wexley. Mira exhaled slowly and reread the document, this time absorbing the full procedural framing of it. A subtle yet methodical maneuver to strip her of authority over her child under the guise of environmental law. This was no longer a bluff. It was a legal trap set to look like a civic duty. She didn't wait. Mira drove directly to the county administrative complex, an aging building with peeling paint and security cameras hanging like limp ears from its corners. Oh, she didn't call ahead, didn't ask permission. She walked straight into the Department of Environmental Oversight and requested to speak with the clerk of records. The woman at the desk, a tired redhead with thick glasses, looked startled at the formality of Mira's tone and even more so at her demand for immediate access to the public filing logs. Mira showed no badge, made no threat. She simply invoked her rights as a private citizen and landowner, stated that she had received a legally actionable notice referencing a complaint she had never been consulted on, and was therefore entitled to examine the source document and related filings. The clerk complied reluctantly. Within 20 minutes, Mira had a printed packet in her hands. 8 pages of submitted forms, all bearing the same name at the bottom, Wexley. Each form cited concerns over Noah's exposure to untreated water, potentially hazardous terrain, and psychological instability stemming from chronic isolation. The most disturbing entry was a supplemental statement attached as a community testimony. It included fabricated details that Noah had been seen wandering the creek bank alone at night, that he exhibited symptoms of anxiety and malnourishment, that Mira was rarely seen interacting with others, and exhibited signs of emotional volatility. There were no sources listed, no corroborating signatures, but the presence of these lines within an official county document gave them weight. Even lies looked legitimate when formatted correctly. Mira didn't argue with the clerk. She took the packet, returned to her vehicle, and sat with the engine idling, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel. She knew the game now. This wasn't about convincing the system of guilt. It was about creating the illusion of instability, death by paper cuts. She returned home and scanned every page, compiling a timeline of escalation. She noted the language shifts, from passive concern to active endangerment. She highlighted the claims that mirrored phrases from her earlier encounter with the faux surveyors. This was coordinated, not sophisticated, but rehearsed. Someone had done this before. She called Jeremy Hauser, a former legal defense consultant who had transitioned into procedural auditing. She hadn't spoken to him in over a year, but his response was immediate when she explained what was happening. They arranged a video call that evening, and Mira walked him through the situation, showing the scanned forms and outlining the timeline. Jeremy was calm, composed, but there was tension in his voice. "This is bureaucratic strangulation," he said. "They're manufacturing legitimacy through unchallenged filings. You have to build a counter-record, official documentation that directly disproves the accusations, point for point, or they'll use your silence as validation." Mira nodded. "I've started that. But I need someone inside the system to confirm the administrative loopholes they're exploiting." Jeremy agreed to pull in a colleague from the Child Services Audit Division to discreetly flag any inquiry or escalation against Mira's name. "They won't touch it if they know someone's watching," he said, "but you'll need to respond through the same channels they're using. No calls, no emails. File your refutations officially. Paper speaks louder than people in county buildings." Over the next 2 days, Mira compiled her own dossier. Affidavits from the school, statements from the pediatrician, food supply logs, water testing reports, dated photos of Noah's daily activities. She wrote her own formal letter of concern, citing the coordinated targeting of her property and family by a named private citizen without evidentiary basis, and submitted it through a courier directly to the county clerk's office. She made 5 copies of everything, 1 for her, 1 for the county, 1 for Jeremy, and 2 sealed for the Office of Legal Integrity. That night, after Noah fell asleep, she sat at the dining table surrounded by the dim glow of desk lamps and paperwork, and stared at the growing stack of proof. It wasn't fear in her chest, it was fury. Cold, focused, judicial fury. They had crossed the line, but it got worse. On the morning of the 3rd day, Noah didn't answer when she called him from the kitchen. She found him sitting silently at the far end of the creek, eyes wide, holding a plastic toy boat he hadn't seen before. "It was floating toward me," he whispered. Mira crouched beside him. The toy was old, scuffed, but it had been recently cleaned. Inside, it was a slip of paper tucked beneath the plastic deck. She unfolded it. Written in childlike print were the words, "Noah, come over and play. My backyard has no rules. We have a pond, too." No address, no name. Just the implication of invitation, a lure masked in innocence. Mira scanned the creek, then the woods. No one. But she felt it. A presence. Someone had been close enough to release the toy, watch it drift downstream, and know when Noah would find it. She locked the gates that afternoon, doubled the chains, and posted no trespassing signs at every visible tree. That evening, she drafted a cease and desist letter against Karen Wexley, citing coordinated harassment, falsified complaints, and psychological manipulation of a minor. She filed it through a third-party courier to ensure tracking. Then she placed a call to a quiet office in the eastern part of the state, a data forensics lab that she had once worked with on a state-level fraud case. She didn't ask for favors. She asked for metadata scans on the county-issued documents and trace analysis of the hand-printed note. "I'm not trying to press criminal charges," she said calmly. "I want the framework in place if I need to." The voice on the other end simply said, "Send what you have. I'll get back to you." But the final blow of that week wasn't paperwork or toys. It was a woman, middle-aged, well-dressed, holding a clipboard, who showed up at the school gate during pickup hours. She approached the security guard, presented something in a sleeve, and asked to escort the child for off-site family evaluation. The guard, thankfully, knew Mira and had flagged her alert status. He stalled, called Mira immediately. She arrived in under 6 minutes, but the woman was already gone. No ID, no vehicle left on the lot, only the description. She said she was with the new parental liaison office, seemed official. Mira didn't show her panic. She thanked the guard, took Noah's hand, and drove them home in silence. When they arrived, the front gate was open. The chain, which she had locked that morning, was on the ground, cut cleanly. On the porch lay a stuffed animal Mira had never seen before, neatly placed, brand new, tag still attached. She picked it up without a word and carried it inside, locking every door behind her. This was no longer posturing. This was active engagement. And Mira knew exactly how to respond. The following Monday brought rain, a steady, unyielding curtain that turned the creek into a thin, rushing river and masked the usual sounds of the forest with a low, constant hum. Mira had been up since 4, sitting at the edge of her father's study window, watching water streak across the glass in vertical lines. It wasn't the storm that kept her alert, but the sudden, complete silence from Karen's side of the conflict. There had been no more letters, no unexpected visitors, no new markers by the creek, and nothing further from the county or child services since her cease and desist notice was delivered. Mira knew better than to interpret the quiet as victory. Pressure like this didn't dissipate. It reconfigured. This was the retreat before the second advance. The silence wasn't surrender. It was strategic, and that meant the next move would be less visible, more surgical. At 10:15 a.m., her secured line lit up. The caller ID displayed an anonymized extension, which meant it was someone from the Office of Legal Integrity. She answered immediately. The voice on the other end belonged to a man named Alan Morse, a case analyst she'd never worked with directly but whose name she recognized from a whistleblower inquiry in 2018. He didn't waste time. We cross-referenced Wexley's filings with local administrative databases. She's filed over 24 civil complaints against independent landowners in the past 4 years, all citing either environmental risk or child endangerment, sometimes both. Most were dismissed, but 5 resulted in temporary custody investigations, and 3 led to forced land easements. Every case was located within expanding development corridors. Mira closed her eyes briefly and exhaled. So she's not just a neighbor with boundary issues. She's running a playbook. Alan's voice stayed even. It's not officially coordinated, but there's a pattern. Her filings align with zoning shifts, and we traced her civic group affiliations back to 2 shell nonprofits registered under different names but with identical financial records. One of them receives funding from a private real estate acquisition firm based out of Portland, Huron Stratagem. Mira had encountered the name once during an asset seizure briefing 2 years ago. They launder land acquisitions through legal intimidation, she murmured. They don't force sales. They induce attrition. Alan confirmed. And Karen Wexley is either a willing agent or a highly useful idiot. Either way, she's not acting alone. Mira requested the documents. Alan sent a locked file within the hour, encrypted and time-sensitive. It contained a cache of internal memos, fiscal trails, and 3 case breakdowns, all unrelated to hers but bearing near-identical patterns. Each victim reported escalating administrative interference, anonymous community complaints, and unprovoked welfare checks. One file included a note that chilled Mira more than anything she'd read before. Subject mother failed to comply with repeated soft nudges, moved to aggressive phase. The phrase wasn't bureaucratic, it was calculated. Codified harassment, dressed in procedural language. She closed the file and stared at her screen. They had a system, and she was inside it now. But she wasn't helpless. Mira knew that information without leverage was only weight. She needed to shift pressure back to Karen, not just institutionally but psychologically. She made 3 calls that afternoon, to her lawyer Jeremy, to the data forensics contact still working on the metadata trace, and to a local investigative notary who specialized in process observation. She didn't reveal her full identity or position. Instead, she requested that an independent observer begin documenting activity around Karen Wexley's property. Not surveillance, but legal mapping of movements tied to civil filings. She wanted timestamps, visitors, package deliveries. Not for court, for strategy. That evening, after Noah fell asleep, Mira took a slow walk around the perimeter of her land, boots sloshing through mud, flashlight slicing through sheets of rain. She paused by the creek, now swelled and dark, and looked across to the narrow trail that led toward Karen's lot. A faint light glowed behind a tree, a motion detector, newly installed. Not hers. Too low to be a wildlife sensor. Too angled to be passive. It was aimed at her property. She walked closer and found the casing, a cheap trail cam, wired to transmit. Not hidden well, but not meant to be. It wasn't for surveillance. It was for provocation, something to spark confrontation. Mira didn't touch it. She snapped her own photo of it from multiple angles and logged it in a document she'd begun to build. Evidence of passive aggression and surveillance. She added time, coordinates, and a description, then returned inside and updated her submission to the Office of Legal Integrity. The next day, Jeremy called with a critical update. One of the forms filed against you, the environmental hazard claim, was digitally altered. The timestamp doesn't match the server registry, and the signature was copy-pasted from an older, unrelated form. Mira's jaw tightened. Forgery. Jeremy didn't hesitate. Yes, but subtle. Sloppy, because they didn't expect pushback. That gives us a window. If we submit this alongside a formal complaint, we can force a pre-investigative audit on her filings. It won't shut her down, but it'll put her under observation. She won't know when or where, and that uncertainty might slow her down. Mira nodded slowly. Do it. Submit everything. Just don't let them trace it back to me. Yet. The shift came 3 days later, not with a knock or a letter, but with an unmarked car parked down the road. Black, low profile, always just out of view from the kitchen window. Mira noticed it in the reflection of her coffee pot, a shape that didn't belong in the woods. She watched it for 3 hours. It never moved. That night, when she returned from town, she saw tire tracks that didn't match her own. Noah's sandbox had been disturbed, barely, but the shapes had changed. Mira didn't tell her son. Instead, she activated a private camera system she'd avoided installing since moving in. Not cloud-based, local, wired, hidden. She didn't trust anything else now. But the moment that crystallized everything, the true midpoint, came when Noah handed her a piece of paper he found in his backpack at school. It wasn't addressed, it wasn't signed, but it read, "Sometimes kids get hurt when parents don't know what's best. Sometimes they disappear and nobody hears them scream." Mira stared at the note for a long, frozen minute. Then she folded it gently, kissed her son on the forehead, and locked every door in the house. She didn't cry. She didn't pace. She sat down, opened a new file, and titled it simply, Retaliatory Strategy, Phase 1. She had always tried to win legally. Now she was going to win permanently. It began with a voice, calm and condescending, bleeding through the speaker of Mira's home intercom system at precisely 7:02 a.m. The system was old, a legacy unit installed by her father decades ago and rarely used since, but now it crackled to life with a tone that chilled her more than any silent visitor or anonymous letter had before. "Mrs. Dunham," the voice said, smooth and rehearsed. "This is a courtesy notification. An inspection team has been dispatched to assess reported violations on your property. We recommend full cooperation to expedite resolution." Then, silence. No identifying agency, no callback number, just the faint click of transmission ending. Mira stood in the hallway, holding a steaming mug of coffee she hadn't yet sipped, eyes fixed on the black plastic box mounted on the wall. The kitchen clock ticked in rhythm with her thoughts. Methodical, detached, calculating. She hadn't connected the intercom to any modern system. Someone had accessed it manually, hardwired from somewhere nearby. She moved swiftly to the breaker panel, flipped the master for auxiliary power, and disabled the line. If they were going to threaten her, they'd have to step through her door to do it. The inspection team arrived 45 minutes later, not in uniforms but in matching navy jackets with embroidered badges that looked legitimate enough to fool the uninformed. 3 men and 1 woman stepped out of 2 white trucks with decals labeled Valley Civic Infrastructure Oversight, a name Mira had never seen listed in the county's registered agency index. Their demeanor was professional, almost bored, as if they were accustomed to showing up uninvited and meeting little resistance. One carried a clipboard, another a topographic scanner, and the third held a digital camera slung low like a weapon. The woman approached first, smiling with bureaucratic precision. "Miss Dunham, we're here to begin Phase 1 of the External Compliance Review. It's standard procedure in response to multiple filings citing environmental degradation and child safety conflicts. This won't take long." Mira didn't move. She stood at the edge of the porch, hands at her sides, heart steady. "You're not coming on this land without proper jurisdiction," she said. "Produce a court-issued warrant or a letter of authorization from a registered State Department, or leave." The woman blinked just once, then turned to the man with the clipboard, who produced a folder and held it out. Mira didn't take it. "Drop it on the step," she said. He hesitated, then complied. She glanced at the documents. No raised seals, no agency headers, no reference codes. "Forgery," she said aloud, making sure they heard her. "If you take one step past that gate, I will treat it as a coordinated criminal trespass, and I will respond accordingly. You will be photographed, recorded, and flagged in the federal complaint already filed against your liaison, Ms. Wexley." That made them pause, not retreat, but reassess. They exchanged looks. One of them muttered something inaudible and pulled a phone from his pocket. The group conferred briefly, then turned, walked back to their vehicles, and drove off without further engagement. But the woman lingered a second longer than the rest, giving Mira a long, unreadable look before joining the others. It wasn't anger. It was evaluation. Mira didn't wait for their next move. She opened her laptop, launched the secured app she'd installed the night before, and uploaded the intercom audio, the vehicle footage, and the folder documents to a live, time-stamped server monitored by 3 independent legal observers across state lines. It was part of Jeremy's failsafe system, a kind of digital black box for civilians under coordinated harassment. She then contacted the forensic lab, pushing for metadata analysis on the newest paperwork, and left a message for Alan Morse. "It's accelerating. They're escalating tactics. I need this flagged as a networked civil manipulation operation, not just a local nuisance. The evidence is stacking." She sent the message, encrypted it, and locked her phone in a signal cage box. From now on, everything would be analog. Anything digital could be intercepted. That evening, just after sundown, a group of 6 people arrived at the edge of her property line. They didn't approach the house. Instead, they stood near the mailbox, facing inward, arms crossed or folded behind their backs, dressed in identical gray windbreakers and baseball caps. No one spoke. They simply stood there. One held a sign, "We watch because we care." Another held a clipboard, visible only when the wind shifted, It was performance. A demonstration meant to unnerve, to make her believe she was under citizen surveillance, that she'd lost the protection of anonymity and was now a public target. Mira turned off the interior lights, grabbed her analog camera and filmed them from the upper window without flash or sound. After 15 minutes, they left. No vehicle. They had arrived on foot. She scouted the perimeter the next morning and found their boot prints stretched along the logging trail near the northern ridge, one of the few paths that led back to the town's newer developments. That night, Mira slept with a flashlight and a steel baton within arm's reach. She didn't tell Noah. She smiled at him, read his favorite book, and said nothing about the people who stood silently in the dark just beyond their gate. Then came the mail delays. Packages Mira had ordered, school supplies, legal forms, a replacement lock for the front gate, stopped arriving. She confirmed orders, verified shipping, but the delivery log showed attempted, access denied, though she'd been home the entire time. She checked the local depot. The clerk, hesitant and polite, said her address had been flagged as a restricted zone due to dispute activity. Mira demanded documentation. The clerk produced a note, unsigned, unsealed, written in basic language that stated, "No current confirmation of resident safety clearance." It had been entered manually into the system by someone with mid-level clearance. Mira filed a Federal Mail interference report the same day. By that evening, 2 packages arrived, battered, resealed, one of them clearly tampered with. Its contents, a set of laminated property markers, were missing. In their place was a stack of religious pamphlets titled, "Saving the Child from the Isolated Mind." She took it all, photos, scans, witness accounts, and submitted it through Jeremy to an emergency review panel within a consumer protection watchdog group. Then, quietly, she rented a car under a different name and drove to Portland, where she met with a private litigation analyst familiar with Huron Stratagem's operations. The man was cautious, skeptical at first, but as soon as she mentioned Karen's name and the fabricated inspections, he leaned forward and said, "You're on their grid. You've got about 2 weeks before the next push. They'll rotate strategies, make it look like the threat's gone, then come back through secondary channels. Medical, educational, tax-based. You need to go preemptive. Burn them before they can finish the pattern." Mira left with 2 flash drives, a burner phone, and the contact for a media litigation consultant, just in case it came to exposure. When she returned, it was to a notice pinned to her front door with a kitchen knife. The paper was damp, the ink smudged, but still legible. "We are watching the child. You can't keep him forever. You're not fit." Mira removed the knife, bagged it, photographed everything, and added it to the growing case file. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. But that night, she placed Noah in the inner bedroom, reinforced the windows, and slept in a chair outside his door. Her only thought, clear, cold, immutable, was, "They have declared war." The final act of the escalation came in the form of a man pretending to be lost. He approached the property late one afternoon, stumbling up the drive in a raincoat, holding a map, asking if this was the retreat center. Mira stepped out, calm, hand on her holster beneath her coat. The man apologized, claimed to have the wrong address, but his boots were clean despite the mud, and the map was blank. She followed him as he walked off, and when he rounded the bend, she saw him hand something off to a woman in a parked car, blonde, thin, oversized sunglasses. Karen. Mira didn't follow. She walked back to the porch, sat down, and whispered to herself, "Now it's personal." And tomorrow it would be her turn. The morning air was sharper than usual, thick with the scent of wet bark and disturbed ground, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Mira had barely slept. She spent the night combing through legal documents, updating the file structure for the civil counterclaims she was preparing, and finalizing a detailed chronology of the last month's harassment. She wasn't just documenting anymore. She was preparing to engage the system on its own terms, not as a victim, not as a petitioner, but as a calculated adversary who knew exactly which institutional levers to pull and when to apply pressure. At 6:37 a.m., she received a single-line encrypted message from Alan Morse. Filed and flagged. Wexley's activity under review. You have about 48 hours before it ripples. That was the signal. The chain had begun. By noon, Mira was at the county office. Not to plead or protest, but to deliver. She handed over a sealed envelope to the clerk, which contained a formal federal request for records disclosure on all prior filings tied to her address, and a notice of formal intent to litigate under civil coercion statutes if county compliance wasn't met within 5 business days. Attached was a certified statement from her legal counsel asserting interference in educational and welfare processes by a private party impersonating government authority. She left without waiting for a response, her heels echoing through the linoleum halls like the ticking of a legal clock. Every movement now had purpose. There were no more discussions, just records. That afternoon, she received a call from Noah's school. A woman had arrived claiming to be a state-appointed advocate, carrying documentation and requesting to sit with Noah during lunch for a protective outreach initiative. The receptionist stalled her long enough to verify that no such advocate had been scheduled. When asked to wait for Mira's arrival, the woman left. Security footage later confirmed it was Karen Wexley, wearing a gray pantsuit and a visitor badge from a different school district, likely stolen or forged. Mira didn't yell when she saw the footage. She didn't shake. She simply forwarded it to Jeremy and filed a second formal cease and desist under an updated threat clause, now citing targeted predatory engagement involving a minor. Karen had crossed the final threshold. This was no longer harassment. It was stalking. Mira didn't go home that night. Instead, she drove to the regional courthouse and submitted an emergency petition for injunctive relief, a rarely used but powerful legal maneuver that, once granted, could impose immediate restrictions on Wexley's proximity to her and Noah. The clerk reviewed the file, brows furrowed at the sheer weight of documentation. "You've been busy," he said, trying to lighten the moment. Mira didn't smile. "I've been hunted." The motion was logged and flagged for review within 24 hours. Mira returned to her father's house just before midnight and sat on the porch, listening to the wind move through the trees like a warning. At 3:19 a.m., motion lights flared to life behind the shed. Mira was up instantly, barefoot, weapon drawn. She moved without sound through the back hall and out the side door, scanning the dark with narrowed eyes. Nothing moved, but on the ground near the chicken wire fence was a fresh print. Boot tread, heavy, recent. And on the wooden post beside it, a single sheet of paper pinned by a long nail. Mira removed it carefully and brought it under the porch light. It read, "You can't protect him forever. You'll make a mistake. They always do." There was no signature, but Mira recognized the pen pressure. Karen. She went back inside and uploaded the print, photo, and text to the encrypted server. Then picked up her phone and dialed a number she had saved but never used until now. It rang once, then connected. "I need Escalation authority," she said. "Not as a civilian. As a federal agent on leave under personal threat by an organized coercion ring targeting my child." The voice on the other end didn't argue. "Understood. Badge ID and case ref?" Mira rattled them off. There was a pause, then, "Level 2 support authorized. Legal counsel inbound. Field observer will be assigned within 36 hours. Mira ended the call and closed her eyes. The system had finally recognized the threat. She wasn't isolated anymore. By the next morning, the shift was tangible. County officials were no longer indifferent. Her petition had triggered internal review procedures, and Karen's name was being quietly circulated among compliance officers as a potential bad actor. Mira received a call back from the school district superintendent personally, expressing concern and support. "We had no idea it had escalated to this point," he said. Mira didn't waste time with blame. "You know now. Act accordingly." He promised additional oversight, and she believed him. But Karen wasn't done. Later that day, while Mira was out gathering affidavits from supportive neighbors who had finally come forward after seeing the unmarked concern groups circling their homes as well, a fire alarm triggered inside her house. She raced home, heart thudding. There was no fire, just smoke from a small flare set off beneath her back deck, positioned beside the propane line, designed to panic, not destroy. Firemen arrived, noted the absence of ignition, and left with vague warnings. Mira collected the spent flare shell, marked it, and stored it with the other evidence. The message was clear. Karen was lashing out. No longer able to win with process, she had reverted to fear. That night, Mira stood in the center of the living room, her files arrayed like a courtroom. Noah slept in a reinforced inner room, unaware of the war being waged outside his childhood. Mira looked at the timeline, the names, the actions, and then at her badge. She hadn't wanted to wear it again. She hadn't planned to return. But now it wasn't about choice. It was about duty. She opened her laptop, activated the secure federal portal, and filed a formal investigative summary under dual capacity: victim and agent. She marked it high priority, citizen risk active, minor involvement, hostile procedural manipulation, suspected development conspiracy. She added every file, every photo, every soundbite, and clicked submit. Then she wrote a single line to Alan Morse. "Everything's on record. I'm no longer asking. I'm executing." And she signed it with her agent ID. The legal system had been warned. Karen had been warned. And now there would be consequences. The sun rose behind a bank of silver fog the next morning, casting a faint, diffused glow across the ridgeline, softening the sharpness of the land that had, for weeks, felt like a battleground. Mira stood at the edge of her porch with a thermos in hand, watching the tree line for movement out of instinct rather than fear. For the first time in days, no figures emerged, no leaf snapped under a stalking footstep, no false delivery trucks idled along the bend. The silence had shifted, no longer tense, but clean. She didn't need confirmation to know the net had closed. That same morning, Alan called. His voice was calm, assured. The review triggered full federal interest. We linked Wexley to at least 7 coordinated filings across the state, all leading to forced compliance actions or land yield. Local authorities are cooperating now. We've frozen her access to court systems pending investigation. The agencies she spoofed are initiating internal reviews. She'll be notified soon, but she doesn't know yet. Mira didn't reply immediately. She let the words settle like sediment at the bottom of a still pond. "Thank you," she said finally. It wasn't gratitude for a favor. It was acknowledgement of a structure she'd reactivated and redirected, a machine she'd once been part of and now had forced to turn back toward justice. The change rippled outward fast. Within 2 days, an official from the state's Legal Oversight Committee arrived at her property to document the harassment chain personally, escorted by 2 agents who didn't wear suits or talk in euphemisms. They took statements, logged evidence, walked the perimeter, and took the flare casing and anonymous notes for forensic analysis. Noah stayed inside during the visit, watched over by a counselor provided by the district, someone patient and quiet who simply played with him, asked nothing, and left him smiling. It was subtle, but the moment mattered. For the first time in weeks, Mira saw her son move freely without that flicker of guarded awareness in his eyes. Later that week, Karen Wexley was served. Not with a single charge or a restraining order, but with a stack of civil actions, fraud inquiries, and a summons for appearance in front of a state administrative board. She received it not from Mira, not from the sheriff, but from a process server backed by 3 observers and a camera team, not for public spectacle, but for procedural clarity. There were no screams, no dramatic denials, just the slow collapse of someone who had built an empire of intimidation on the assumption that no one would push back with equal force. Karen tried to contact Mira once, through a mutual contact asking for a conversation to clear things up. Mira declined. Silence was more powerful than confrontation now. She didn't need closure. She had evidence. Weeks passed. The mailbox returned to normal. Deliveries resumed. The patrol cars stopped near her property not to watch her, but to check the area at her request. The forest settled back into its rhythm. The rain returned, gentler now, and the creek swelled with clean, fast water. Mira never reinstated the motion sensors or the panic buttons. She didn't need to. The threat was over, not gone, but displaced by consequence. Her land was hers again, not just by deed, but by presence. She met once more with Alan and Jeremy, sitting in a quiet corner of a courthouse office reviewing the final filings. "You could pursue damages," Jeremy said. "This kind of interference, the risk to Noah, it's actionable. Settlements have been won for less." Mira shook her head. "I don't want her money." "I wanted her stopped." Alan nodded. "She's stopped. And others watching her will stop, too." That night, Mira walked the creek's edge with Noah at her side, both of them barefoot in the cold mud, the sun setting behind the ridgeline. She pointed to the rocks her father once used to mark the boundary of their land, simple stones stacked by hand. "These don't look like much," she said to her son, "but they held more than fences. They held the idea that this place couldn't be taken." Noah didn't respond with words. He bent down, picked up a small flat stone, and added it to the pile. They stood in silence, wind in their hair, the house behind them no longer a bunker, but a home. Mira didn't forget what happened. She archived it, recorded every step, made sure the system she once served understood exactly how close it came to losing a family to silence. But she didn't build her life around it. The fight was over, not because she won, but because she endured, exposed, and proved something larger than one conflict, that when truth is backed by preparation, boundaries become shields, not lines in the dirt. And those who try to erase them eventually drown in the consequences they thought would never touch them.